Holy shit. He said what?
Oh, I was there, hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was the worst royal engagement I ever did, a royal wedding I ever did. And I travelled the world with him, and I did really enjoy working with him. But, you know, now I really don't care if I ever see him again, because the way he's behaved towards the king and our queen and his brother and his sister-in-law is appalling.
What if I told you that the most glamorous royal wedding of our time, the one broadcast across the globe to billions, wasn't the magical love story we were promised, but a calculated performance that insiders now call one of the biggest disasters in royal history? Forget the sparkling carriages, the elegant gowns, and the choir that made millions watching from home believe they were witnessing a modern-day fairy tale. Behind the cameras, behind the choreographed smiles, was a very different story, one of chaos, humiliation, and betrayal. At 85 years old, royal photographer Arthur Edwards, a man who has spent his life documenting the crown, from Charles and Diana's epic wedding to William and Kate's seamless ceremony, has finally broken his silence. And what he revealed about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's wedding will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about that day. According to Edwards, this was no celebration of love. It was no grand moment of royal unity. Instead, it was a circus, a Hollywood premiere staged inside Windsor Castle, where loyalty and tradition were shoved aside to make room for celebrity spectacle. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the opening act of something much darker. And if you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear what insiders actually endured that day. Because once you do, you'll never look at those glossy wedding photos the same way again. On the surface, the day looked flawless. The world tuned in to watch Harry, the beloved spare turned global icon, marry Meghan Markle, the American actress who had supposedly brought a breath of fresh air into the monarchy. For viewers, the broadcast was picture perfect. Flags waving, choirs filling the air, celebrities glowing in the pews, and carriages gliding through Windsor like something out of a storybook. But as Arthur Edwards explains, that polished image was nothing but smoke and mirrors. What television cameras captured was not a wedding in the traditional royal sense. It was a performance carefully choreographed for maximum global impact. From the very first shot, it was clear that this wasn't about honoring centuries of tradition. It was about creating a spectacle that could dominate headlines and set the stage for Harry and Meghan's new life as global celebrities. The guest list told the story before the vows were even exchanged. Where loyal royals and longtime servants of the crown once sat proudly at the front rows in weddings past, this time they were shuffled to the back, almost as an afterthought. Imagine dedicating your entire life to the monarchy, standing by through decades of service, only to be told your seat wasn't good enough. And who replaced them? Hollywood names who, in many cases, had only just met Harry and Meghan. Oprah Winfrey, who at that point had barely crossed paths with the couple. The Clooneys, who weren't close friends, but were ushered into prime seating as though they were family. Industry contacts and celebrity acquaintances, many of whom seemed more interested in posing for cameras than celebrating a union, suddenly found themselves in better seats than senior royals who had carried the monarchy for years. Edwards couldn't believe what he was seeing. To him, the wedding felt less like a royal event and more like a red carpet premiere disguised in royal clothing. He later admitted that he thought to himself, "This is all showbiz rubbish." For decades, royal weddings had been symbols of continuity. Charles and Diana's marriage was the spectacle of a generation. William and Kate's ceremony symbolized a modern yet deeply respectful union that reassured the public the monarchy was in safe hands. But Harry and Meghan's wedding? It broke that pattern. It wasn't about family or duty or the institution. It was about optics. And that's where the real cracks began to show. Because while the television audience saw magic, those inside Windsor Castle were experiencing something else entirely. Discomfort, humiliation, and what many later described as one of the most miserable royal events they had ever attended. But the uncomfortable seating arrangement was just the beginning. What happened next turned the supposed wedding of the century into a day that guests and insiders would never forget. And not for the reasons Harry and Meghan had hoped. The fairy tale people saw on television didn't match what those inside Windsor Castle experienced. Guests who had been honored to attend were soon whispering that it felt more like an ordeal than a celebration. The sun blazed relentlessly on Windsor that day, and instead of comfort or consideration, attendees were left to suffer in silence. Imagine sitting shoulder to shoulder in heavy coats and elaborate gowns, packed into the pews, with no airflow and no relief. Women clutched paper fans like they were oxygen masks on a failing airplane, dabbing at their foreheads as makeup ran and nerves frayed. Arthur Edwards, a man who had stood through countless royal engagements, said it flat out. It was the worst royal wedding I ever covered. Think about that. This is someone who has documented nearly every major event in the monarchy for decades, rain or shine, joy or tragedy, and even he called this day miserable. He had captured Charles and Diana's wedding, one of the largest televised events in history, under intense pressure. He had endured the chaos of Andrew's wedding, Sophie and Edward's, and William and Kate's grand union. Yet, none of them compared to the discomfort and chaos of Harry and Meghan's day. And the worst part? The suffering wasn't accidental. It was the result of a complete disregard for the comfort of those present. The cameras mattered more than the people. The optics mattered more than tradition. While millions around the globe were mesmerized by sweeping shots of Windsor, the guests inside were struggling just to stay upright. The atmosphere was suffocating. Not romantic, not joyful, not even dignified. People weren't whispering about love. They were whispering about how much longer they could endure it. What should have been one of the happiest days in royal history became a test of endurance, a spectacle where tradition was sacrificed for the sake of an image. And if that wasn't enough, the seating arrangement, who was pushed aside and who was given the spotlight, revealed even more about what this day was really about. If the brutal heat didn't break spirits, the seating plan certainly did. To longtime royal observers, it wasn't just a choice, it was a statement. For generations, royal weddings had honored loyalty and tradition. Senior family members, military veterans, and those who had given decades of service to the crown were seated proudly, visible to all, as a testament to their sacrifice. But on Harry and Meghan's wedding day, that was all thrown aside. Distinguished royals, lifelong servants of the monarchy, were shunted to the back rows like afterthoughts. People who had carried the institution through crises, who had dedicated their lives to upholding its image, found themselves humiliated. They were barely visible, tucked away where the cameras wouldn't capture them. Meanwhile, the front rows, the seats of honor, were handed to Hollywood celebrities. Oprah Winfrey, the Clooneys, actors and industry insiders who had little, if any, genuine connection to the couple, strutted into Windsor like it was a red carpet premiere. Arthur Edwards couldn't hide his disgust. He admitted he thought to himself that day, "This is all showbiz rubbish." And that's exactly how it looked. A glossy networking event dressed up in royal clothing. Imagine being a royal cousin, a family member who had been there through Harry's childhood, or a veteran who had fought under the flag of the crown, only to be pushed aside for actors who might not even exchange another word with the couple after that day. That wasn't an accident. It was a choice. This wasn't about family. It wasn't about monarchy. It was about which faces would look best when the cameras zoomed in. It was about creating the perfect photograph for glossy magazines and entertainment news, even if it meant trampling over the very people who represented the monarchy itself. And it wasn't just the seating. Even the photographers, the very people tasked with documenting the day for history, were punished and sidelined. And that's where the story takes an even darker turn, because Prince Harry himself made sure of it. If guests thought the heat and seating humiliation were the worst parts, they hadn't seen what Harry had in store for the media. Because this wedding wasn't just uncomfortable, it was used as a weapon. Royal photographer Arthur Edwards explained that, for the first time in his decades-long career, he couldn't get a single usable shot of the bride and groom. Not one. Think about that. This is a man who had captured Charles and Diana, William and Kate, every milestone of the royal family for more than half a century. Yet, on Harry's wedding day, he walked away empty-handed. Why? Because Harry made sure of it. Instead of embracing the cameras, as royals are trained to do, Harry turned it into a battle. Every moment that should have been an iconic photograph, a glance, a smile, a wave, he deliberately avoided. He turned his head away from lenses, blocked angles, refused to cooperate. He didn't just ignore the cameras, he punished them. Edwards said bluntly, "I felt we were punished for that day." And he wasn't exaggerating. Photographers scrambled, using long lenses from hundreds of feet away just to capture anything usable. One described it as trying to shoot a wedding through a keyhole. Meanwhile, the hand-picked celebrity photographers inside the chapel, sitting just feet from the couple, had the kind of access career professionals could only dream of. It wasn't an accident, it was Harry's vendetta. For decades, royals had understood the deal. You smile, you pose, you allow the world a glimpse, because that's the unspoken contract between the crown and the people. But Harry broke that contract. He wasn't interested in honoring tradition, he wanted revenge. He blamed the press for Meghan's harsh reception, for the headlines during their engagement, for every slight and criticism she endured, and instead of rising above it, Harry decided to strike back on the biggest stage of his life. Arthur Edwards admitted it was unlike anything he'd ever seen. William and Kate had made every effort to ensure the world shared in their joy. Charles and Diana, even amid their personal struggles, understood the responsibility of the moment. But Harry? He treated his own wedding like a grudge match. And in doing so, he didn't just sabotage the press, he sabotaged his own legacy. Because this was no longer the joyful union of a prince and his bride. It was a personal protest, staged in front of millions. But as bad as that was, the hostility toward the media wasn't the only thing guests noticed. Because when the ceremony ended and the reception began, people expecting royal abundance were met with another shock, one that left them shaking their heads in disbelief. Royal weddings have always been synonymous with grandeur. Endless banquet tables, flowing champagne, and meals so lavish they made headlines of their own. Guests walk away full, indulged, and dazzled by the scale of royal tradition. But Meghan and Harry's reception, it was something else entirely. Instead of a feast fit for monarchy, attendees were greeted with what Arthur Edwards later described as nothing more than a glorified cocktail hour. Tiny canapes, bite-sized portions that looked good on a magazine cover but left people hungry. Avocado toast, macarons, finger foods, the kind of trendy minimalist menu you'd expect at a fashion launch party, not the royal wedding of the decade. Guests who had spent thousands on their outfits were left nibbling at snacks that could barely satisfy a child. Some laughed it off, others were quietly furious, but almost everyone was shocked. For centuries, royal weddings had symbolized abundance, food and drink overflowing as a reflection of stability, prosperity, and continuity. Yet here, there was only minimalism, curated for Instagram aesthetics, not tradition. Edwards himself said the portions were pathetic, symbolic even. All style, no substance. And that symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room, because it wasn't just the food that was meager. It was the respect for the institution. The grandeur that once defined royal occasions had been stripped away and replaced with a performance, chic, modern, photogenic, but hollow. It was as if Meghan and Harry weren't trying to host a royal wedding. They were hosting a brand launch, one where the guests were nothing more than props. And for many who attended, that was the moment it became clear. This wasn't a celebration of love or unity, it was a statement, a deliberate rejection of tradition, disguised as modern, but carrying a much harsher undertone. Guests walked away hungry, literally and symbolically, because what they had witnessed was not abundance, not generosity, not continuity. It was a warning shot, a declaration that Harry and Meghan weren't just different. They were ready to break the mold, no matter how many people they alienated along the way. And the fallout from that reception didn't end when the last canapé was eaten. It carried over into what happened next, the way Harry and Meghan treated their own family in the days and years that followed. If the wedding itself revealed cracks, what came afterward turned those cracks into canyons. Instead of the wedding being the start of unity, it became the starting point of estrangement. Traditionally, a royal wedding cements family ties. It's not just about two people saying, "I do." It's about generations joining, reinforcing bonds, and strengthening the fabric of the monarchy. After Charles and Diana's wedding, the images of her with the Queen Mother symbolized continuity. William and Kate's union brought warmth between the Windsors and the Middletons, blending tradition with modern family life. But Harry and Meghan's marriage? It seemed to do the opposite. Almost immediately, the couple began distancing themselves from royal traditions. Invitations to stay at royal estates were turned down in favor of hotels and private residences with private security. Family gatherings that had once been a cornerstone of royal life became rarer and rarer. Even when opportunities arose for the younger generation of royals to bond, cousins growing up together, grandparents passing down traditions. those moments were cut off. Arthur Edwards, who had spent decades watching royal families interact behind the scenes, admitted it was heartbreaking. He recalled one moment where a senior royal saw the very first picture of Archie not from the family album, but from Edwards himself showing it on his phone. Imagine that. A grandmother seeing her grandchild for the first time through a press photo. What made it sting even more was the public image Harry and Meghan projected. They spoke endlessly about the importance of family, compassion, and togetherness. They positioned themselves as defenders of love and connection, but behind the palace gates, they denied those very things to their own relatives. To Edwards, it was hypocrisy in its rawest form. He said plainly that the children were missing out, not just on traditions, but on relationships that define a family legacy. Cousins who should have been playmates were strangers. Grandparents who should have had cherished moments were left isolated. The wedding, far from uniting the royal family, had accelerated its unraveling. What should have been a chapter of joy became the opening line of a story about cold shoulders, broken ties, and deliberate estrangement. And just when it seemed the rift couldn't deepen any further, Harry and Meghan stepped in front of cameras once again. This time, it wasn't a wedding stage. It was Oprah's garden. And the world wasn't prepared for what came next. If the wedding was the opening act, the Oprah interview was the encore, and it was twice as ruthless. The sit-down was marketed as a truth-telling moment, a raw conversation that would peel back the curtain on royal life. But to insiders like Arthur Edwards, it was nothing more than a performance, a carefully staged broadcast designed to detonate, not to reconcile. On camera, Harry and Meghan delivered explosive claims. Racism, cruelty, lack of support, mental health struggles brushed aside. They painted themselves as martyrs, as victims of an ancient institution that refused to bend. Millions tuned in expecting honesty, but what they got, Edwards argued, was a script. And the timing couldn't have been more strategic. By the time of the interview, sympathy for the couple was fading. Their Hollywood-style wedding had raised eyebrows, their decisions to distance themselves had frustrated insiders, and their public battles with the press were growing tiresome. But with one primetime broadcast, they managed to pull the spotlight back onto themselves. Edwards didn't mince words. He called it a stunt. Not a conversation, not a healing moment. A stunt designed to embarrass the monarchy and elevate the Sussexes as the tragic heroes of their own story. For the royal family, it was devastating. Allegations were hurled into living rooms across the globe, while those accused had no platform to respond. Generations of royal dignity, built carefully over centuries, were suddenly dragged into Oprah's backyard. And for the children, Edwards said, the fallout was especially cruel. Family fractures deepened, opportunities for reconciliation shrank, and the chance for Archie and Lilibet to grow up with their cousins became more remote than ever. It wasn't about truth. It wasn't about resolution. It was about control. Control of the narrative, control of the spotlight, control of the brand. For Harry and Meghan, the wedding may have been their debut, but the Oprah interview proved something far bigger. Scandal wasn't just part of their story. Scandal was their currency. And that realization set the stage for what Edwards and many others now believe to be the true legacy of Harry and Meghan's so-called fairy tale. When the confetti had fallen and the glossy photos made their rounds across the world's front pages, you'd think the story of Harry and Meghan's wedding would be remembered as a modern love story. But according to Arthur Edwards, and to many who were there that day, the legacy was something very different. Because in the years that followed, it became clear that the wedding wasn't the beginning of a happily ever after. It was the blueprint for everything that came next. The spectacle, the control of optics, the prioritization of Hollywood faces over royal blood, the hostility toward the press, the obsession with branding over tradition. Every detail of that wedding became a roadmap for the couple's future. What began as a day of supposed unity turned into a declaration of independence, a line drawn in the sand that said, "We don't need the monarchy. We don't want the monarchy. We'll build something better, on our terms." And that's exactly what they did. The staged interviews, the streaming deals, the tell-all memoirs, the speeches, they weren't detours. They were extensions of that wedding day performance. Just like the uncomfortable heat, the humiliating seating, the pitiful reception, and Harry's vendetta against the cameras, every move afterward followed the same playbook. Shock, disrupt, dominate headlines. Instead of upholding centuries of ritual, Harry and Meghan tore them down. Instead of strengthening family bonds, they fractured them. Instead of showing grace under pressure, they weaponized their grievances for maximum coverage. Edwards, looking back, called it one of the most miserable experiences of his long career. Not because of the heat, not because of the discomfort, but because he realized in real time that something sacred was being dismantled in front of him. The legacy of the so-called fairy tale wasn't romance. It was rupture. Not harmony, but hostility. Not unity, but division. And the truth? That wedding wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a prologue. The opening chapter of a saga that continues to shock the world to this very day. So when people look back at the Windsor spectacle, they may remember the carriages, the choir, the celebrity guest list, and the polished smiles. But those who were there, those like Arthur Edwards who endured the heat, the humiliation, and the hostility, they remember it differently. They remember it as the day the crown was treated like a stage prop, while Hollywood walked away with the spotlight. Harry and Meghan didn't just get married that day. They rewrote the rules of royal engagement. And the fallout from that decision is still echoing across palaces, headlines, and family relationships to this very moment. Because what looked like a celebration of love was really the first act of a long-running circus, one where every scandal, every interview, every falling out has been carefully orchestrated to keep the world watching. But here's the kicker. If you think this wedding disaster and the Oprah interview were shocking, wait until you hear what happened next. Because in the years that followed, one of the most unexpected public figures, a comedian of all people, took to live television and absolutely shredded Meghan Markle in front of millions. It was brutal, it was hilarious, and it left even her supporters stunned. And trust me, you're going to want to see it for yourself. That story is up right now. Click here for the video on how Trevor Noah hilariously destroyed Meghan Markle live on stage. Because if Windsor was the opening act, Trevor's takedown was the moment the spotlight turned, and the narrative shifted forever.